Molly Jacobs, a typical 15-year-old, was constantly dealing with the ups and downs of teenage life, frequently rebelling and often at odds with her mother, Linda. Linda tried to control every aspect of Molly's life, dictating who she could be friends with and critiquing her clothing choices. She rarely listened to Molly or asked about her interests or school life, and she was unaware of Molly's closest friends. Although Linda's intentions were to guide Molly toward what she thought was best, their relationship greatly suffered. Molly appreciated her mother's concern, but understood that what was best for Linda wasn't necessarily best for her. Meanwhile, Molly's father, Jim, known as Jimmy to everyone, had a different approach. He maintained a calm demeanor and believed in not sweating the small stuff. Jimmy encouraged Molly to express herself as long as it didn't harm herself or others. Whether it was dyeing her hair blue or getting a nose piercing, Jimmy was supportive, even signing permission slips when needed. Jimmy's rules were simple: no lying and always being honest. He emphasized speaking openly, expressing emotions directly, and avoiding secrecy. Secrets can eat away at who you are, he'd tell Molly, and they always come out, often causing more damage the longer they're kept hidden. His rule about loyalty extended to staying true to one's principles, being a reliable friend, guiding others to make better choices, and offering support. Jimmy's integrity and sociable nature made him well liked, enhancing his reputation as a copyright lawyer and partner at a high-tech law firm. Despite his busy job, Jimmy made it a priority to attend Molly's soccer and softball games and participate in her school events. He also set aside time for activities like hiking, biking, fishing, and camping with Molly, recognizing the fleeting nature of her teenage years. While Linda occasionally joined, she often skipped these outings, leading Molly and Jimmy to form an exceptionally close bond, which sometimes left Linda feeling envious. On her days off, Wednesdays, Linda would mention she spent her time cooking, cleaning, shopping, or visiting her parents. However, Molly frequently noticed her Uncle Dan's pickup truck passing their house, suggesting he had just visited. When Molly asked Linda about Dan's visits, Linda sometimes denied them, even though his truck had been nearby. Other times, Linda explained his presence as Dan borrowing tools, asking about landscaping, or just stopping by to chat with Jimmy. Molly found these justifications somewhat odd. Linda typically got home before Molly finished her sports practice around 5 or 5:30 p.m., and always before Jimmy, who arrived between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. One school day, after lunch around 12:30 p.m., Molly began having severe menstrual cramps. She asked her teacher if she could visit the nurse and was allowed to leave early after convincing her. Molly tried calling Linda for a ride but received no response, eventually leaving a voicemail explaining her situation and noting that she would walk home unless Linda could come and pick her up. However, Linda did not return Molly's call. As Molly walked down the street, she spotted Uncle Dan's truck parked in the driveway, thinking he might be there to grab some tools. When she got to the door, she found it locked, which seemed unusual. Unlocking it with her keys, Molly entered to find the main floor empty and dark. A quick look inside the garage showed no sign of Uncle Dan. Suddenly she heard strange noises coming from upstairs. Her curiosity aroused, Molly quietly climbed the stairs and headed toward her parents' bedroom. She peeked around the corner of the door and was shocked to see her mother, Linda, with Uncle Dan. Molly's heart pounded as she watched Linda and Dan, tears welling up in her eyes. Shocked and angry, she quickly retreated, her mind reeling from the betrayal by her uncle and her mother against Jimmy, her father. Fury built within her, and she decided to capture the scene on her phone. Linda and Dan, oblivious to Molly's presence, continued their indiscretions. "Yes, you filthy man, don't stop," Linda cried, and Dan responded with a smirk. "I enjoy this more than Jimmy ever could." They laughed together, but Molly's anger boiled over. Bursting into the room, she shouted, "You cheater! How could you betray our family? And you, Uncle Dan, sleeping with your brother's wife. You both disgust me." Linda and Dan froze, horrified as they realized Molly had been recording them. Molly ran out, storming down the stairs as Linda shouted, "Molly, please. Wait, it's not what you think. Come back," but Molly was already out the door before Linda could catch up. Linda rushed back to Dan, frantic. "Get dressed, start the truck. We have to find her before she tells Jimmy. He'll never forgive us, and it'll destroy everything." She broke into sobs, while Dan snapped, "You can cry later. Right now we need to move." Molly sprinted through backyards, ignoring Linda's repeated calls, and made her way to the 9M Creek Nature Trails, a place she often visited with her father. She collapsed behind their favorite cottonwood trees, her refuge, and buried her face in her knees, overwhelmed by the betrayal. How could her mother do this to her father and her? How could Dan betray his own brother like this? She couldn't stop crying as she fought with these thoughts, ignoring Linda's desperate attempts to reach her. Linda, meanwhile, had been repeatedly calling Molly with no luck. Left to voicemail, she sent messages explaining her absence from school and time with Dan, even as she continued to kiss and touch him, ignoring the calls she assumed were from Jimmy. Despite the guilt, thrill, and fear of interruption, Linda had been seeing Dan secretly for about 10 weeks, every Wednesday. She knew the affair was reckless, threatening her family and marriage, but she struggled to end it, convincing herself it was harmless indulgence. She failed to see the emotional toll it was taking, driving a wedge between her and her loved ones. The weight of her actions and the risk she was taking hovered over her, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. As Linda tried to reach Molly, she started to understand the extent of the damage. She'd hurt herself, her husband, and most painfully, her daughter. Molly's condemnation stung deeply, and Linda realized the far-reaching consequences of her choices. Her love for Jimmy and Molly was real, but her actions threatened to ruin it all. Now, terrified of what might come next, she left frantic messages begging Molly not to tell Jimmy, fearing the fallout. But Molly, still devastated, chose to call her father instead. On the second ring, he answered with a familiar warmth. "Hey there, little rebel. What's going on? Shouldn't you be in school? Are you okay?" Jimmy could hear his daughter's tearful sobs, her voice filled with distress. "Molly, what's going on? Are you hurt? Where are you? And where's your mother?" he asked, clearly concerned. "Dad, please hurry. I need you. I'm by the trees. Don't tell Mom or answer her calls until you're here." Molly pleaded. "Molly, what happened between you and Linda?" "Are you okay?" Jimmy inquired. "Just come, Dad. No calls to Mom, please. I really need you right now," she insisted. "Stay put. I'll be there in 20 minutes," he assured her. Jimmy hurried out of his office, telling Beth, "One client had a breakdown, we'll need to reschedule tomorrow." "I'll explain later." He ignored Linda's incoming call, keeping his promise to Molly, and drove across town. Parking quickly, he ran down the path, still in his work attire, and found Molly curled up among the trees, tears streaming down her face. He rushed to her side, embracing her as she cried uncontrollably, her body shaking with emotion. "Molly, did someone hurt you? What happened? Was there a fight with your mum?" Jimmy asked gently as he held her. Molly's phone showed 10 missed calls from Linda, and Jimmy's phone rang again with another call from her. Jimmy hesitated but obeyed Molly's request not to answer. "Dad, I'm lost. You always said to be honest and loyal to family, never to hide secrets that gnaw at you. But what if telling the truth only makes things worse? What if it destroys everything?" Molly confessed. "Molly, I can see you're hurting. It's hard, but facing the truth is better, and we'll get through it together," Jimmy encouraged. "Oh, Dad, I'm so sorry. Did Mum call you? If she left a voicemail, please don't listen to it yet," Molly begged. Jimmy, confused, accessed Linda's voicemail. "Jimmy, we need to talk. Molly and I argued, and she ran off. She's upset, and I don't think she fully understands what she saw. Can you find her, or ask her to call me? Jimmy, please know I love you and Molly more than anything." Jimmy set the message aside and focused on Molly, who let out a sarcastic snort. "Now, listen to my voicemails," she said. Molly played the first message from Linda, who was crying. "Molly, it's not what you think. It meant nothing. It was just an innocent mistake. Please call me before doing anything drastic or speaking to your father." Molly sneered. "Just an innocent mistake," she muttered. Jimmy, puzzled, was about to ask more when Molly urged, "Dad, just be patient. Let's listen to Mom's next voicemail." Linda's tone was pleading this time. "Molly, please talk to me. Don't tell anyone, especially your dad. It will ruin everything." Molly erupted in anger, shouting, "You're blaming me for tearing apart our family." "That's unbelievable." Jimmy, utterly confused, interjected. "Molly, start from the beginning. You need to explain everything." "Dad, are you sure? Mom said this would destroy us, but I think she's already done that," Molly replied, meeting his eyes. "Molly, don't hold back. We need to understand what happened," Jimmy insisted. Molly took a deep breath. "I wasn't feeling well at school, so I went home early and tried calling Mom, but her phone was off. When I got home, Uncle Dan's truck was in the driveway, and the front door was locked. I let myself in, but no one was downstairs. I heard noises from your bedroom, so I quietly went upstairs." she explained, her voice breaking. "Dad, I'm sorry. I recorded what I saw because I didn't know how to explain it. You need to see this." Molly handed Jimmy her phone, her face buried in her knees. Jimmy watched the video, seeing the betrayal unfold before his eyes, the shame and guilt written on Linda and Dan's faces when they were caught. Jimmy turned off the phone, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Why, God? How could she do this with my own brother?" he choked out, unable to find more words. Molly clung to him, saying, "I feel the same, Dad. I never want to see them again. They've destroyed us." Meanwhile, Linda tried reaching Jimmy at his office, but his receptionist said he had left abruptly. She offered to take a message, but suggested Linda call him directly if it was urgent. Frustrated, Linda hung up. She and Dan abandoned their search for Molly and returned home, finding the house dark, Jimmy's car gone, and no sign of Molly. "Linda, I just hope Molly doesn't do anything reckless," Dan said quietly. Linda feared Jimmy would find out, knowing he would never forgive them. She thought it was time to head home before Amanda started questioning her whereabouts. She resigned to wait and see how everything would play out. Overwhelmed by her mistakes, Linda struggled to speak through her tears. "Take me home, Dan," she pleaded. "I have to figure out what to tell Molly. I need to reach her before Jimmy does and convince her that it meant nothing. If she tells Jimmy, our lives are finished." With that, she dialed Molly's number again but reached voicemail once more. "Molly," Linda cried into the phone, "I'm so sorry. Please, it meant nothing and it's over. Call me before you speak to anyone, please. Don't tell Jimmy, it will ruin everything." Hanging up, Linda exited the car and hurried back to the house. She tried to call Molly again, knowing there would be no response. In the master bedroom, she stripped the sheets and replaced them with fresh ones. A routine she had adopted every Wednesday after Dan left for the past 10 weeks. Sitting on the bed, Linda broke down. "Why did I do this?" she sobbed, questioning why she had risked her marriage and her family's respect. She didn't even care much for Dan and certainly didn't love him. Her love for Jimmy had never faltered, but she had noticed her growing emotional distance from both him and Molly. Linda wondered why she constantly criticized Molly, when she had stopped being open and loving with Jimmy, and when she last showed him any real affection. "What is wrong with me?" she thought. She realized much of her actions were driven by the thrill of secrecy and doing something just for herself, even if it was wrong. Her life had felt monotonous. No one seemed to need her anymore. Molly had pulled away, ending their once open and loving relationship, while Jimmy was too wrapped up in his demanding legal career, focusing more on Molly after Linda emotionally withdrew. Jimmy had sensed their growing distance, but when he suggested therapy, Linda brushed it off, insisting everything was fine. Linda felt unneeded, but now she knew she was wrong. Dan had showered her with compliments, making her feel valued in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. He, too, was disconnected from his wife, Amanda, who was preoccupied with her pregnancy, leaving Dan feeling neglected at home. His flattery had drawn Linda in, leading to their escalating intimacy. Now, Linda recalled Molly's look of pain and betrayal when she had called her a cheap woman, a label Linda couldn't deny. She reflected on her actions and the bonds she had broken with Amanda, Dan, Jimmy, and their families. "How did I let it get this bad?" she thought, overwhelmed by the realization of her own recklessness. Collapsing onto the bed, she wept uncontrollably until exhaustion took over. Meanwhile, Jimmy and Molly sat by the trees, speaking little but sharing their grief. "What do we do now?" Dad Molly asked. Jimmy, filled with hurt and anger, replied, "I don't know, sweetheart. I'm devastated, not just by Linda's betrayal, but also by my brother's. You've been dragged into this, and our family will never be the same. I'm not sure I can ever face Linda again, let alone forgive her. But she's still your mother, and you'll always need her." He suggested they find a hotel to rest and sort through their emotions, deciding on the Hilton, where Jimmy planned to work remotely the next day. Over the weekend, Jimmy reached out to his friend Jack Wilson, the district attorney, informing him of the situation and asking him to delay any action on the missing persons report that Linda might file. Jack agreed but set a deadline of Monday, urging Jimmy to talk to Linda by then. At the hotel, Jimmy and Molly settled in with burgers and fries, unwinding in front of the TV until they finally drifted off to sleep. Around 10 p.m., Linda woke up to see no missed calls from Molly or Jimmy. Panic set in. "Oh God, Jimmy must know by now, or he'd have reached out." She frantically tried calling them again. but her calls went straight to voicemail. Desperate, she sent Jimmy a message. Jimmy, I know you know, but please understand it meant nothing. I only love you. Just confirm Molly is safe and come home so we can talk. Unsure of how Jimmy would respond, she began drafting her side of the story, hoping to explain when he was ready to listen. She stayed up until midnight, waiting for any sign of a response, but nothing came. Finally, she crawled into bed, her sleep plagued by guilt and regret. The next morning, Jimmy and Molly were up early for breakfast at the Hilton. Jimmy informed Molly's school that she would be absent for 2 days and told his work he'd be working remotely. He turned to Molly, saying, I'm so sorry you had to see all this. At your age, I hoped you wouldn't have to understand the complexities of loyalty, honesty, and staying true to your values. But life can be hard. And it's crucial to hold on to your morals. Mum lost sight of that when she got involved with Dan, and the betrayal that followed can't be undone. We'll figure this out together. Determined to get answers, Jimmy called Dan. Dan, step outside. I don't want Amanda to hear this, he said when Dan picked up. Dan quickly moved to the porch. What's going on? He asked. Jimmy's anger erupted. What do you mean, what's going on? Tell me honestly, when did this start with Linda? And why? Dan hesitated but finally admitted, Jimmy, I'm sorry. Once we started, it just kept happening, but it was never about you. It was purely physical, nothing more. Jimmy, enraged, pressed further. How long? Dan confessed. 10 weeks, every Wednesday, always at your place. Jimmy yelled. How could you do this to me? Dan tried to explain. It just happened. I wasn't getting much attention from Amanda with the pregnancy, and it led to this. Dan admitted he was drawn to Linda, and things escalated from kissing to making out, eventually leading them to sleep together. I'm truly sorry. We both love you and never intended to hurt you or break up your family, he pleaded. Jimmy replied, Forgive you? Dan, here's how it will be. I won't talk to you or see you again, and if I do, you'd better run because I'll confront you. You're dead to me now. I don't consider you my brother anymore. Despite Dan's pleas for understanding, asking Jimmy not to let this destroy their bond, Jimmy responded furiously, It was everything to me, Dan. You shattered my marriage and my trust. How can you say it means nothing? You both cared so little for us that you couldn't even spare us this pain. Jimmy ended the call, convinced it was his last conversation with Dan. On Thursday and Friday, Jimmy and Molly stayed at the hotel, working from their room, eating at the restaurant, and taking breaks outside for fresh air. Linda kept trying to reach them, calling repeatedly, but they ignored her calls and voicemails. Unsure of how to contact Jimmy and Molly, she also attempted to reach Dan, who didn't respond either. By Friday afternoon, Linda was desperate and went to the police station to file a missing person report. My daughter is missing, and I need to file a report, she told the officer at the desk. After collecting Linda's information, including names and addresses, the officer asked her to wait. Soon after, Jack Wilson, the district attorney, came to speak with her. Mrs. Jacobs, I'm a friend of your husband Jimmy. Molly is safe, she's with Jimmy. He contacted me knowing you might file a missing person report. We agreed that I'd wait until the weekend to give him time to get in touch with you before taking any official action. Molly's fine. But that's all I can share right now. Jimmy will contact you, but if he hasn't by Monday morning, call me, and I'll step in. He handed her his card and escorted her out, his cold demeanor indicating he knew more than he let on. Linda sensed that Jimmy had told him everything and realized arguing wouldn't help. She returned to her car, sank into her seat, and began to cry once more. Back at the Hilton, Jimmy turned to Molly and suggested, I think we should at least let your mum know that you're safe. Would you like to speak to her? Molly replied, No, Dad. I never want to speak to her again. I can't see how I could ever forgive what she did. How can we believe anything she says now? How can we ever trust her again? Jimmy responded, Molly. I know we're both hurting and feel deeply betrayed, but with time, the pain will lessen. We'll need to decide if we want to move forward or try to rebuild our family. I'm thinking we should go home and give her a chance to explain herself. We need more clothes, toiletries, and your school things. Let's hear her side of the story and then decide what to do. Molly and Jimmy drove back to the house and entered through the front door. The house was quiet and dim, except for the light in the kitchen, where Linda sat, sipping coffee and staring at her cup. She looked as though she had aged years since they last saw her face swollen with tear stains, smeared makeup, and unkempt hair. When she saw them, Linda jumped up and rushed to hug Molly, but Molly backed away, avoiding any contact. Jimmy followed her lead, keeping his distance. "Linda, we're here to discuss what happened and why. You've hurt us deeply. Our love and trust in you are broken. I'm not sure if we can move past what Molly saw, but I want to hear your side of the story." With tears streaming down her face, Linda grabbed a tissue, wiped her eyes, and blew her nose. She faced them and said, "I'm truly sorry. Please understand that this had nothing to do with you. I love you both more than anything. It was just a mistake, it meant nothing, and it won't happen again. Please don't end our marriage over one lapse in judgment." Jimmy's anger flared as Linda continued, clearly avoiding the full truth. Addressing Molly, he declared, "We're going with Plan B." Molly left the kitchen to gather her things. Once Molly was out of earshot, Jimmy turned back to Linda and said, "You're still making excuses, claiming it was just a meaningless fling. I spoke to Dan, and I know it's been going on for 10 weeks. I've seen the video of you with him, humiliating me. Who's lying here? Linda, you or Dan? I know it's you. I told Dan he's dead to me, but with you, it's more complicated." Jimmy continued, "This wasn't a single mistake. It was an ongoing affair. You wouldn't have stopped if Molly hadn't caught you. You disrespected our family by carrying on with my brother in our own home. Don't lecture me about giving up on our marriage. You were the one who gave up first. Molly's only 15. How do you expect her to handle?" What she saw, Jimmy stormed upstairs, leaving Linda sobbing on the kitchen floor. She had hoped to sway him by lying about the affair's duration, but his rage was like nothing she'd ever seen. She now doubted any chance of mending her relationships. Minutes later, Jimmy and Molly came down with their suitcases. Jimmy removed his wedding ring, placed it on the counter, and they left without another word. Linda stayed behind, curled up on the kitchen floor, weeping. Jimmy and Molly returned to the Hilton, but Jimmy immediately began searching for apartments close to Molly's school and his office. He contacted rental agencies and secured a 6-month lease on a modern 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment with amenities like a pool, spa, barbecue area, and gym. The next morning, Jimmy dropped Molly off at school, then returned to start moving their belongings into the new apartment. He quickly organized his finances, splitting their accounts and transferring pre-tax savings and shared funds into separate accounts, one in his name and one in Linda's. After making arrangements, he consulted a well-regarded divorce attorney for a meeting that afternoon. His financial advisors informed him that because of the college funds he had established for his daughter, he could secure a substantial part of their combined savings and investments into a trust dedicated to her education, keeping it safe from divorce proceedings. He also named Molly as the beneficiary of his insurance policy. Following 10 days of strategizing the divorce plan and sorting through financial changes, he instructed his lawyer to start preparing the divorce documents, but postponed filing them. During this time, Linda persistently contacted Molly and Jimmy via calls and texts, pleading with them to talk, attend marriage counseling, and come home. Jimmy directed his office security to deny her entry, while Molly spoke with the school's vice principal, explaining the circumstances and convincing them to restrict Linda from the school grounds. Around this period, Molly received a puzzling voicemail from Linda's parents, expressing confusion about why Molly and Jimmy were treating Linda so harshly over a minor disagreement. They criticized their silent departure, questioning what they saw as unnecessary cruelty. Molly reached out to Jimmy's parents to see if they had any information. She called and greeted, "Hi Grandma, how have you been? Have you heard anything from the family lately? It's been a while since we last spoke." They responded that nothing significant had happened, just waiting for Dan and Amanda's baby, and inviting Linda, Jimmy and Molly to brunch the next weekend when Dan and Amanda would be visiting. Molly realized that the family was unaware of the real situation. Linda hadn't told her parents the truth, and Dan hadn't informed Amanda or their parents either. Later that evening, Jimmy got a call from Linda's sister Sherry, upset about his departure, saying, "Jimmy, how could you? This isn't like you at all," leaving Linda over a disagreement about Molly's schoolwork. "You two have always managed to work things out before." Jimmy simply stated that there were private matters between him and Linda that needed time to resolve. 20 minutes later, Linda's parents echoed Sherry's sentiments, questioning Jimmy's decision to leave over trivial issues. To end the night, Jimmy's parents called, inviting Linda, Jimmy, and Dan over for brunch. Molly watched as Jimmy dodged accusations, realizing that neither Linda nor Dan had shared the truth. Turning to Jimmy, Molly remarked, Clearly, neither Linda nor Dan told the family anything close to the truth, and somehow it's all on you. She was furious, but her father shrugged it off, saying things would eventually work themselves out. 2 weeks later, after much thought and conversation with Molly, Jimmy decided he could not forgive Linda's betrayal, deception, and refusal to admit she had broken her wedding vows. It was clear she took no responsibility, nor did Dan. Jimmy decided it was over and directed his lawyers to serve Linda with the divorce papers. At home, Linda wrestled with how to convince Jimmy and Molly to return so she could repair their relationship. Despite knowing she had hurt them, she tried to convince herself that it was just a meaningless closeness and that everything could go back to normal. She reassured herself that they would miss her and come back, picturing herself as the most loving wife and mother once they returned. While contemplating how to start a conversation with Jimmy, she heard a car pull up and then a knock at the door. Looking out the window, she saw a young man in a suit. Opening the door cautiously, she confirmed her identity. The young man handed her an 8x11-inch folder, saying, "Mrs. Jacobs, you have been served," before quickly taking a photo of her with the package and leaving. Confused by his words, Linda retreated to the living room, sank onto the sofa, and tore open the envelope. She choked back tears as she read petition for divorce at the top of the first page, and as the reality set in, she dropped the papers, realizing for the first time that she had sacrificed her marriage and family for meaningless closeness. A few days after receiving the divorce petition, Jimmy was overwhelmed with calls from Linda and his own parents, accusing him of ending the marriage over minor disagreements. Dan's wife Amanda then called, reprimanding him. "Jimmy, how could you cut ties with Dan over arguments about tools and consider divorcing Linda over such trivial issues? You need help, Jimmy, maybe counseling." Jimmy tried to deflect, reiterating that this was a private issue involving Linda, Molly, and himself. He suggested they speak to Linda directly if they wanted to understand the reasons for the lack of reconciliation and the need for divorce, but the calls continued. They even started reaching out to Molly, pleading with her to return home to her distraught mother. Seeing Jimmy's distress and the family blaming him, Molly realized Dan had not told the truth and instead attributed their disputes to the loss of some of Jimmy's tools. She observed Linda's attempts to mobilize all available family resources to convince Jimmy and Molly to return, noticing Linda's refusal to admit her actions or share the truth. Aware of Jimmy's integrity, Molly knew he wouldn't reveal damaging details that could break Linda and Dan's bond with the family. However, Molly reached her breaking point. She opened her computer and wrote an email to the entire family, to all family members, "Quick to blame my dad for the problems between my mum, Dan, and him. It deeply pains me to send you the attached video. I know it will shock and hurt you as it did me when I walked into this nightmare and recorded it. It is unjust for Jimmy to be punished by his own family for something he didn't do. He was betrayed by his wife, brother, and now his own family. I'm done with it. Please watch the video and consider what you would do if you were in my father's position or mine. Imagine being betrayed by two people you trusted to love and support you unconditionally, who instead deceived you in the worst way and continued to deny it without taking any accountability. Please view the attached video privately, then feel free to discuss with my mom and Uncle Dan how you think Dad should react." She included everyone's email addresses, anticipating her father's strong reaction but feeling the need to stand by him, Linda, and Dan. With a click of the send button, she dispatched the email. While Linda was at work, she missed her personal emails and her phone remained off. At the end of the day, she turned on her phone, hoping for a response from Jimmy to her numerous calls, asking for forgiveness and begging him to let her explain and make amends. Instead, she saw missed calls from her parents, Amanda, and Jimmy's parents. She began by listening to Amanda's voicemail. "You're despicable. Not only did you ruin Jimmy's life with your affair with Dan, but you've also destroyed mine. I never want to speak to you again, and I will fully support Jimmy in the divorce. He treated you with love, respect, and did everything for his family, but you threw it all away with your disgraceful behavior. Maybe Dan will take you in, since he's being kicked out tonight." Linda wasn't sure if Dan had confessed or what had occurred, but she had a sick feeling that the family knew the truth. The next voicemail, 3341, came from her mother Linda. "How could you? It was disgusting and heartbreaking for me to watch this video with your brother Jimmy in your marital bed." And then poor Molly walked in, witnessing her mother and uncle's disgusting betrayal of her father, herself, and the entire family. "Why did you do this?" Linda collapsed into the driver's seat, tears streaming down her face. She reluctantly pulled out her iPhone and opened her email to find a message from Molly. Despite her hesitation, she clicked on the attached video, already knowing what she would see. It wasn't just the explicit nature of the video that disturbed her, it was hearing Dan's voice so clearly, participating in those actions once again. "Screw me, you filthy boy, and don't you dare stop," she screamed. Dan replied, "I love making love to you, and I'll satisfy you better than little Jimmy ever could." If that wasn't enough, their shared laughter and cruel banter stung deeply, and then came Molly's pain, shock, and rage as she shouted, "You deceitful strumpet, how could you betray our family like this? And you, Uncle Dan, you slept with your own brother's wife. I despise you both, you worthless scum." Linda knew it was over. Her efforts to reach out to her family, persuade Jimmy to talk, and change his mind were futile. What consumed her thoughts was more deception, more disrespect, and a refusal to admit that their actions were as damaging as the affair itself. She finally acknowledged that she was deluding herself about Jimmy. There was no going back. He was deeply hurt, far too much, and she realized she had irrevocably severed her bond with her daughter. She no longer had the right to pretend to be a mother. Any advice or guidance she offered would seem hollow, nothing but empty hypocrisy. She cried in the parking lot for an hour before mustering the strength to start her car and drive home. 3 weeks later, Jimmy's lawyer called to inform her that since she hadn't signed or returned the divorce papers, a court hearing had been scheduled in 2 weeks. He advised her to get legal representation and prepare. On a friend's recommendation, who had also gone through infidelity and divorce, Linda found a divorce attorney. She openly admitted her actions with Dan and explained how she ended up in this situation. After reviewing the documents, the lawyer told her, "Your husband is being reasonable, proposing a 50/50 division of assets. There's no evidence of hidden assets or attempts to harm you by releasing the video, except for one condition: he wants sole custody of your daughter. This is rarely granted. So I suggest we contest this matter in court and let the judge decide." In court, it was the first time Linda had seen Molly or Jimmy in 8 weeks. They looked well, and Molly appeared older and more mature than Linda remembered. Neither Jimmy nor Molly acknowledged her, and when she tried to speak to them in the hallway, they simply walked away. "I'm so sorry. Please don't hold on to hatred forever. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but the thought of you hating me forever is unbearable. If there's any chance of us having some kind of relationship, I would be grateful," she pleaded. With those words, they walked into the courtroom, and the trial began. When the issue of 100% custody arose, the judge hesitated, leaning towards the typical 50/50 arrangement. At that moment, Jimmy's lawyer gestured towards Molly, prompting the judge to allow her to speak briefly. Despite it being an unusual request, the judge permitted it due to her age. Molly stepped forward, and both attorneys moved closer to hear. "Your Honor." Molly addressed the judge, "I do not want to live with my mother. Our relationship is broken beyond repair. If you give her custody, I will run away. I won't spend a single night at her house. Please watch this brief video to see what I came home to one day after school. The man in the video is my uncle, my dad's brother. This has been happening for 3 months and might not have ended if they hadn't been caught." With those words, she played the video on her phone and handed it to the judge. As he watched, his expression changed. After returning the phone, he asked everyone to be seated. "I will grant the father full custody as requested," he declared. "Therefore, the mother will not be responsible for child support, and given the father's financial situation, I will not require her to contribute either. Regarding visitation," he continued, "the mother will have a 2-hour visit with her daughter each week for the first 6 months. These sessions will include counseling, funded by the father, whose attendance is optional. The goal is to assess whether a bond can be re-established between mother and daughter for their future well-being." With this, the judge adjourned the session, rose, and returned to his chambers. Linda broke down in tears as she heard the decision granting Jimmy full custody of Molly, yet through her grief, she clung to a faint hope that, with the help of therapy, she might begin to rebuild a connection with her daughter and possibly even with Jimmy. This had become her only goal in life, and she was determined to ensure that Molly knew she was loved. Linda wanted Molly to understand the magnitude of the pain she had caused, not just to Molly, Jimmy, and the rest of the family, but also to herself, as her affair had devastated everyone involved. A year later, the counseling sessions between Linda and Molly proved successful. Linda gained an understanding of her actions and the reasons behind her choices, while Molly began to see the depth of Linda's suffering, possibly even more than her own and Jimmy's. Though this did not lead to forgiveness or acceptance of Linda's actions, Molly began occasionally spending weekends at her mother's apartment. Linda adjusted her behavior, treating Molly as an independent adult, giving her freedom in her choices, and refraining from judgment. Linda apologized repeatedly, but one day Molly told her to let it go, leave it in the past, and don't bring it up again. Linda tried to gather any information about Jimmy from Molly, his appearance, whether he was in a relationship or if he was happy. Molly recognized Linda's deep feelings for Jimmy, but also knew that he was not willing to trust or love her again. Instead of encouraging Linda's fixation on Jimmy, Molly urged her to focus on new aspects of her life, including dating. Jimmy refused to participate in counseling sessions, mended his relationship with his parents, and grew close to Amanda and her children. Linda left Dan and began rebuilding her life. True to his word, Jimmy ignored any attempts by Dan or his parents to reconcile. If Dan was present at family events, Jimmy would stay away. It had been a year since Jimmy last interacted with Dan, and he was at peace with his choice to sever ties for good. Over the past year, Jimmy's primary focus was on his relationship with Molly, prioritizing her above everything else and placing work as a lesser concern. He refrained from dating and avoided social outings with friends. Molly, sensing that he might be ready for a fresh start, encouraged him to consider dating again. Meanwhile, Linda deeply regretted her past behavior, reflecting on the meaningless nature of her brief affair. Although it had been momentarily exciting, it caused great damage to the people she loved most. The guilt and heartache from her choices haunted her constantly, leaving a permanent mark on her life. Linda came to terms with the impact of her actions, realizing she had been reckless to ignore the consequences. Driven by lust and the fleeting thrill of secret intimacy, she had given up the fulfilling life she once enjoyed. Faced with the harsh reality of adult pain and hardship, she had lost the love, trust, companionship, and happiness she once shared with her family, understanding that those things were now lost to her forever.